Good afternoon to all of you. Welcome. Thank you for being here this afternoon. It is a very, very special pleasure and a great honor to have Ray Gindroz among us today. Ray is one of the great living architects and urbanists in the world, certainly one of the protagonists of the new urbanist movement in the United States, and a person who has given us a great deal of insight both through his writings, his his projects, and his teaching. He went to school at Carnegie Mellon, both undergraduate and graduate. He's been involved within urbanism for at least 40 years, so 35 and counting on the movement, and 5 or 10 preceding it as as an advocate for its ideas before it was actually formed. He is co-founder and principal emeritus at UDA in Pittsburgh, out of where he did most of his life's work. And his greatest contributions are not only the many beautifully designed projects for new communities throughout the US, but also more specifically in his influence on the Hope 6 project, which was his national new urbanist movement to turn public housing into neighborhoods. His general further advocacy for continuing this effort beyond Hope 6 with ongoing initiatives in a variety of ways. And finally, for his revisiting and regenerating the notion of pattern books and coding in general as ways of having neighborhood cities and particularly individual people and communities of people engage with the planning and design process. I mean, I think it's fair to say that UDA, through his work and uh, and David Lewis's, were probably the first people, the first instance in the United States where somebody advocated that community should have a role in the generating of a built environment. And this at a time when, as he said to me today, buildings were landing like spaceships on American cities. Many of us have admired his work for the longest period of time. It's an immense pleasure having him here. I hope that he lectures today and also allows us to ask him a whole bunch of questions. Particularly inspiring, I think, is not only his advocacy at the urban design and architectural level, but also his ability to connect built environments and living environments with people, institutions, and causes that have to do with environmental, social, economic progress in people that are generally also underprivileged. So he is very much, as you can tell, a person that is operating within the the mission of this School of Architecture. It's a great pleasure having you here, Ray. Thank you for being with us. Please welcome Ray Gindroz.
Are you done with that remote? Welcome. Are you done with that remote? Okay.
I'm here to help if you need me anyway.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great joy to be here, see so many old friends. The subject is revitalizing inner cities, which, of course, is a vast topic. I'm going to focus on one part of it. Stefan has already said that the main focus of our work was finding ways of meaningfully engaging residents and citizens in the process of planning their own community. It was more complicated than residents, of course, because city officials, property owners, business people, religious leaders, civic leaders all need to be part of that package so that you have a comprehensive view of what the issues are, and then you can find solutions. I thought maybe I'd spend a minute clarifying one thing about our process. I've been thinking about this lately because community participation in processes constantly come under attack from different directions, some friendly fire, some unfriendly fire. I just want to be clear about how we saw it. You know, it's almost still true, if you get a very good doctor, that he or she will sit and talk to you, listen to what's wrong with you, but also talk generally. And those conversations are really data collection, trying to understand what's going on and what your perception of it is. And we see our engagement of citizens in very much the same way. We're learning about the neighborhood. We're learning about their perceptions of the neighborhood. Here's one example. We were working in a place that had a reputation, a perception, but a reputation as being a high crime area. But the statistics didn't reflect that. So we asked the police if it was a high crime area or if it was safe. They said, well, it's perfectly safe. We know. We're there every day with our dogs. We asked an elderly woman whether it was safe or dangerous. She said, of course it's dangerous. Why else would the police be there with their dogs? In another case, safety was being described in terms of manpower and police. And then one woman got up and said, the best security system is a nosy neighbor. Now, this was a design charrette. So imagine the change of focus that made from thinking about protective barriers to thinking about ways of designing buildings, houses, public spaces so that nosy neighbors could do their job most effectively. So it's that kind of input and information that we always treasure from being engaged with citizens because we only know half the problem and the issues by looking at it analytically. People on the ground really know. But I'm not going to talk about that anymore. I'm going to focus on the way the design of cities impacts people and neighborhoods sociologically and psychologically, which has been a central theme of my passion since I was in graduate school. And I present to you a work which you may or may not have seen. It is a mural in the University of Rome's campus at the edge of the Esquilino neighborhood. It's in a building built in the 1950s, which was a police barracks and was, of course, a dreadfully bare and austere room. An American artist named Doug Cooper was commissioned to do murals around the entire room. This is but one part of it. And I love it because it's a magnificent portrait of the Esquilino neighborhood. To do his work, Doug spends time living in the places, talking with people, getting them to do some sketches, and then he winds up putting them in the mural. So the people that you see, particularly on your left, are the people he had interviewed. And he tries to embody in the mural the things that they describe that were important to them. Now, is there a forward key? What happened to the keyboard? Sorry. Is it possible to use it? I'm sorry. I'm old-fashioned person. Not only old, but old-fashioned. Okay. So let's look at it a little bit more closely. This is one panel which has the piazza in front of Santa Maria Maggiore. I'm sure you all know it in Rome. And we see human beings running around doing all sorts of different things, riding a motorcycle, actually graciously stopping to let pedestrians go across, miracle of miracles. And we see that this dazzling perspective construction of ducks really creates the stage set for everyday life. Little girl walking her dog, or the dog walking the little girl, it's not clear in this drawing. A young woman on a cell phone in a jazzy sports car is zipping past. But if you look just above that, you'll see that the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore has been represented with a section cut. And in it, it's represented as it was in the 5th and 6th centuries, with the monks from that period in that. So that we're seeing everyday life in the context of a great sense of history, which the residents of that neighborhood were aware of and very proud of. And the landmarks very much a source of great pride. Now we're going to go up in the drawing and look at a close-up. And you'll see over on the right, a little hard to see, you'll see there's Michelangelo's Moses rising up out of San Pietro in Vincoli, in which it's located, because that's another source of pride. And to the left, to his left, you'll see there's a man, oversized, helping a little child over the top of the Colosseum. This is recording a conversation that Doug had with an elderly man who remembered as a child that the Colosseum was not closed off and secure the way it was. It was just an open public space. And he and his friends used it as their playground. And so this mural reflects that wonderful relationship between great landmarks and daily life. If we go to the left, you'll see the column from the piazza is still there, and we look at cross sections through buildings. Doug was very influenced, as you can see, by medieval painting, so scale is constantly manipulated and changed. And we see people in all sorts of interactions, dancing in the streets, singing in a cafe, having a drink, meeting with friends, doing shopping, being together, creating a sense of community by being together, which is the essential ingredient in creating social capital, which is that sociologists call the economic value of a cohesive and strong community. And if you look to the right, behind the monument, you'll see the marvelous late 19th century buildings, which are similar to the Paris model, which I'll show you in a little bit, which are definitely mixed income in their form, but with a noble architecture, which does a great deal to lift the spirits and provide a sense of dignity for everyone in the community, irrespective of their income. So these qualities, I love this mural and Doug's work because it shows vividly the relationship between people and the city in which they live. So there are four qualities that sociologists and psychologists have delved into over the course of the last 70 or 80 years that I'm going to discuss. And I'll illustrate it with some existing examples and then some examples from our projects which show how they played out. One is dwelling as mirror of self. What does the image of your dwelling tell you about yourself? Social capital. How do neighbors get together to create social capital? Diversity, we know, is extremely important, particularly for people in poverty, to be in a mixed income, more diverse environment. And knowing how to use the city, we've learned that a person's ability to use the city is directly related to his or her chance of succeeding in life. All of these things, it seem to me, are design criteria that we as architects and urban designers must respond to. The difficulty is that these issues are the most difficult to achieve in the current development and building and planning process. They get trampled by other considerations, some real, some not real. And that's why I think it's so important to talk about them and highlight them. Now, these are not my ideas. Many different personalities played into it. Jane Jacobs, I know you're familiar with because you walk into and see her portrait every day as you come into the architecture school. She was extraordinary. I had the great pleasure of meeting her a couple times and hearing her speak as the book was being written and afterwards. She was very impressive, quiet, low key, very straightforward, and fairly dramatic in the way she dressed. She wore a black knit dress, very French, with brilliant ochre colored stockings and these enormous glasses. So this is someone you paid attention to when she walked into the room. And she spoke so sensibly about real human experience. It was when you're in her presence, it was hard to remember that the entire planning profession and development industry was in a rage over the kinds of revelations that she'd made. She really turned the whole idea of planning upside down. Kevin Lynch was a planner. In person, he was exactly like he is in this photograph. Very straightforward, interested in how people perceive the environment and gave some initial structure to that. And Holly White, for his descriptions of the social life of small urban spaces and then setting criteria for good spaces, made a remarkable contribution. I had spent 2 days with him once, only time we were together. It was in the city of Charlotte. and we'd walk around at noontime when lots of people were on the streets, and he'd make comments and observations and make notes, but he always had a little counter, these counters that people use when you're going into an event to count it. And so whenever we got to a street corner, he'd be doing this and continue talking all the while he was doing it. And then at the end, he'd look down, make a little note of what it was, so that his observations were in metric terms, not just in observation. But the most influential person I never met, and that's Alvin Shore, looking not very happy in this drawing, in this photograph. It's the only one I could find. He was a social worker, professor of social worker, and under the Kennedy administration, he was Deputy Secretary of HUD for research. And in that period, he compiled the previous 10 years' worth of research on the causes of poverty and published them in a little tiny book called Slums and Social Insecurity, in which he poses the astonishing question that really changed my life, which was, is there a causal relationship between the physical form and imagery of cities, homes, and neighborhoods, and a person's ability for a capacity for upward social mobility? He never said yes or no, but he gives a series of examples that show how it can work. And it's from this man that I really charted my career. Um, I'm not even sure that I realized it, that it was going, but it was. So, of the 4 points, the first one is dwelling of mirror of self. And I don't think I need to explain these two cartoons. This is by the French artist Jean-Paul Sampé, who sadly is no longer alive. Did a lot of New Yorker covers. And he captures beautifully, I think, the relationship between architecture and people. So one woman is filled with joy in front of our house. The obviously brutal businessman who controls everything is absolutely thrilled with the homage his apartment building is paying to his great success in its architecture and doorway. So these are two very positive images of the way in which the mirror of the house at home represents ourself and presents a positive image. On the other hand, these are from the Harper's Weekly 1890 publication that documented some of the slum situations in New York. And clearly, this little fellow who's struggling across the street does not have a very positive image. And the key in Shore's word is the image compared to what is considered mainstream in society, whether it's through the media. When Shore wrote the book in 1963, it was the Brady Bunch. So people living in these kinds of conditions or in public housing were comparing themselves to that. That is such a negative impact on one's self-image that it diminishes self-confidence and makes it much less easy to succeed in life. The Among the worst, and I've deliberately given this a really bad photograph, but among the worst images of self is what American public housing had evolved into by the 1970s and 1980s. Barracks-like buildings, originally inspired by German social housing, which is a very different social structure than American society, but diminished into the least common denominator, making what they believe to be the cheapest possible and most indestructible buildings, set generally in open landscape without definition of public and private space. In one project, a man stood up and said this about the stigma of living in public housing. He said, brown buildings, brown windows, brown grass, brown people. It makes others in the city afraid of us. Another comment was, public housing architecture is to the illegal drug industry what McDonald's arches are to arches. So the image of this housing is dreadfully important. An early project of ours, which I keep coming back to, it moved me more than anything else, was one in it's this one, and we were asked to do some exterior remodeling. There was money for minor improvements to the exterior. And there were drug wars going on. The drug gangs had taken over. Residents were afraid to come out of their buildings. Bullets were flying at night, so they slept on the floor. And the director of housing said, I don't see how new windows or the kind of usual repairs is going to change that social situation. What can be done? So we did a very simple thing, which was to add the features of a traditional neighborhood. So the red brick building on the right is the same buildings that we were looking at before. And you can see on the top is a little axonometric of the buildings as they existed, which were just barracks on greens. There was a number plate at the end of each one with the numbers of the units in that row because there was no street in front of the units, only at the ends. So we added porches, which in Norfolk, Virginia is on almost every house. The residents, when we were designing it, insisted that they and the windows be white and be very simple and not complicated and certainly not modern, but be what we would find in a normal neighborhood, which is a theme that keeps running through all of the conversations we've had in public housing residents. We added a little street so they could park in front of their house and have an address, which is really one of the most fundamental elements of being a citizen, having an address, and fenced off the backyard to prevent some of the things that were going on. So this is shortly after the first phase was built. And this man standing here looking out, you see, has planted a wonderful garden in front of his porch. Before he couldn't do that. No one could plant flowers because they'd be trampled on and ripped up by the gangs. And he was very adept at it, so he was teaching his neighbors how to do the same. And another person loved to garden but couldn't before. And you can see she's working quite industriously on her garden. She was so enamored with her garden and loved it so much that she made clothing for herself with floral motifs sitting in it, dwelling as mirror of self, the reflection of who we are as people and as architects and urban designers. We must be very careful about who it is our imagery is intended to work for. The school was nearby. Teachers told us that after the renovation, the students in the school had higher grades because they were no longer kids from the project, they were kids from the neighborhood, dwelling as image of self. In a different project, somewhat earlier in 1978, in Richmond, in Randolph, a traditionally African American neighborhood, the middle had been demolished and the edge still had some of the traditional houses, which were these. Residents loved those traditional houses, wanted them to be preserved, and wanted new houses to be like that. So we developed the very first pattern book, which set up construction documents for the front facades. And here it was built. One morning, I went to see it when it was partially built, very early, 7 in the morning, and a man came out from a side street 2 blocks away, saw me, immediately came charging over, looking quite angry, wanted to know what I was doing in his neighborhood. And I said I had been involved in the design. What did he think of the design? And he looked at me angrily. He said, "What, are you blind? Can't you see? Man, this is a neighborhood. There used to be houses on Jacqueline Street. Then they were torn down. Now there are houses again on Jacqueline Street. This is a neighborhood. We look after each other." I can't credit the architecture entirely with that, but the fact that it was rooted in the place and reflect what the tradition is, I think is important. In 2007, after the hurricanes Katrina and Rita, we were asked to redevelop the Lafitte Public Housing Project, which you can see here on the left in its condition right after the flood. Brick buildings, very institutional style. In New Orleans, most people live in houses, not in brick buildings. When this particular one, for instance, a double shotgun, that's two houses in the width and the length of a Volkswagen, but they're 60 feet deep, so they've got all the rooms you want. In a tumultuous series of public meetings where advocates from all over the country, including a television program, tried to prevent the demolition, the residents proclaimed that they wanted a new life. They didn't want to keep the old buildings. And they said, we'll gladly trade the bricks for a house. That led the design process to do nothing but houses, sometimes double houses, sometimes small apartment houses, but they were all houses. And here's from the second charrette, a model with movable parts being conducted, by the way, by a Notre Dame grad of probably 1998, and to discuss how it works. But look on the wall. You see their elevations and plans of houses. We had 9 architects come and design houses. Marianne Cusado, for instance, was one of those people. Brings back memories. And we pinned them all up on the wall. Now, we also had a group of architects from Tulane who insisted on doing modernist houses, and they were up on the wall. We gave residents green dots for what they liked, red dots for what they didn't like. So anything that looked like a house, particularly a traditional house, got a green dot. Something that looked like an institutional building got red dots. But the modernist buildings got red dots. One person said, who would want to live in something that looks like a phone booth? So there's a strong sense of local identity that's tied to these houses. And so to be able to make it affordable, we worked with builders to have standardized building types and use the pattern book approach to add porches and other things to make it equivalent. And one of the main streets has a whole series of those shotguns and double shotguns to accommodate residents. There's a brilliant example by a whole series of architects in Santa Barbara, California, in which the Public Housing Authority commissions architects to do things in the Spanish colonial style, which is what the majority of the big wealthy houses and the commercial areas are. So that homeless people, public housing residents, have a dignified place. And the staff there has told me that they're very low recidivism rate, high employment rate, all of the metrics that indicate people are succeeding. But as I said, this is difficult. All too often, this kind of thing happens where these are the front entrances to buildings that are moderately subsidized housing. Somehow in that process, these values get crushed. And although this was also a low-income project, you have to work very, very hard to hang on to those values. And I find that the best way is to find whatever the vocabularies are that are most admired in a given community and work with those, is you have a better chance of realizing it. The second point is about neighbors, community, and social capital. Another Sampé drawing of communicating in the neighborhood. And the second thing about social capital is people look out after each other. I don't know whether you can see this, but if you look very carefully, you'll see a woman with wide-eyed terror looking at the cat who's perfectly calm about balancing on the rail. So this is people looking out for each other and all creatures, great and small, in their neighborhood. When something happens, like the tree trimming, everybody gathers round and has an opinion from their balconies as well as from the street. That's social capital at work. Back to the same public housing project, people said, the residents said, we would like to have porches, not because we need another room, but so that we can see each other, come together, be together, and deal with our problems. The community police officer said before the demolition, before the restoration or redevelopment, when something happened, an incident happened, no one saw anything, no one heard anything, no one said anything. Afterwards, he's deluged with calls about every little thing that happens because it's building. They've built a sense of social capital. It lasted for 15 years, not doing so well now because it's still an enormous concentration of people in poverty, which just doesn't work. But the American cross section, of course, facilitates this. The front porch, front yard, all connecting to the street. So it's a space that's both public and an extension of the family's house. The same Richmond neighborhood that I spoke to, they're tiny houses, but we managed to get very large porches tacked onto them. And since you only see them from the front, you don't notice how almost ludicrous it is that these are supersized porches. So in 2018, which was 40 years after they were built, I paid one of a regular number of visits to this neighborhood. And we parked over on the left side of the photograph in front of a house. And I went out, walked around, and took pictures, and my wife stayed in the car. And she said she noticed after about 5 minutes, a man in the closest house came out with a broom and started sweeping his porch. And then in another 3 or 4 minutes, a house 2 houses down, man came out, started sweeping his porch. And then before not, you knew it, 5 or 6 people were out sweeping their porches. And my wife decided it was time to do something about it. So she went up to explain that I had been involved in the design of this and was coming back to see how it was doing. So the first man she spoke to went to his door, opened the door, and shouted a loud voice so the whole neighbors could hear, "Honey, that architect is here. He's back again." So all was safe. That's social capital at work in a neighborhood. There are many forms for this. Porches aren't the only thing. Sometimes there are communal spaces within blocks, like this place in Pittsburgh. You can see it in the aerial photograph with the lawn, where it's 13 townhouses grouped around a green set up above the street. And it becomes a place for all sorts of activities in the course, but it's still connected to the street. But there's a cohesiveness within this community that is very strong in social capital. I don't know whether you're familiar with Catfiddle Street. In Charleston, it was developed by a group of friends. It's in the middle of a block, and it's a group of friends to begin with, so it has a strong social capital. But it is an example of spaces like this within blocks that can function well in an urban environment. And certainly in Italy, this works well with the courtyard buildings. I don't know whether you know the Navigli Quarter in Milan. It's where the canals are, and it's not a very fancy neighborhood, but it's a very vibrant and alive, wildly diverse community. And there are two types of courtyards. This is called the palazzo type, where the units are grouped around the courtyard and the stairs are in the corners. So you can see even on a gloomy day, it brings some cheer and light to it. But I've interviewed people in that building, and I asked if they could trust anyone in the building, and they said everyone, 100% they could, to help. If we needed a problem, they would help. And they build social relations just because of the casual contact coming through. There's another even more powerful example about 2 blocks away where former factories have been turned into condominiums occupied mostly by writers, artists, craftsmen, designers. And there are shops and workshops and sale shops, display rooms on the ground floor and apartments above in what's called Case in Ringhiera in Milano, which is houses with railings. And they too have this incredibly strong. I was privileged to be there for an event in several of them, and I talked to people, and they told me about the structure of the community and the kind of congenial atmosphere that they have. Now, not everything works well. One of the works I admired in my youth was Rossi's Galleritese housing, which you see on the left. Been there several times since, and I'm about to talk to someone who lived there. But it's devoid of any kind of activity compared to this one, which is in the Navigli courtyard filled with activity. So what's the difference? The space is under houses, where the space and the Milan example is surrounded by houses. So there are no eyes on the street. In the one, plenty of eyes on the street, ground floor activity, all working extremely well. Point number 3, diversity and social mobility. Um, Sociologists tell us that a person, a child growing up in a community with 30% or more poverty rate has very little chance, 4 or 5% chance of succeeding in life. This is a statistical average that's taken over many communities in different parts of the country. If that child has parents who grew up in a community with more than 30% poverty, the chance is almost zero that they would be able to succeed. So therefore, diversity is extremely important. You can see in this chart, in some of these examples of Hope 6 projects that rebuilt them, that suddenly there was a huge increase in employment, decrease in crime, great increase in educational achievement for the children. So that's a fact, proven now. But getting diversity in our society, in the United States, is very difficult. NIMBYism runs rampant. It's very hard to insert low and moderate income housing into affluent communities. It's easier to attract middle and upper income people into impoverished areas, and particularly in the rebuilding of public housing, which is one answer. It's not the whole answer, but it's one answer. And so I'm going to show you just a couple examples of that main feature of much of our work. I'm going to first talk about diversity models. Everybody knows about the Paris cross section, right? Haussmann's codification of what was the traditional French model. The ground floor in pink was commercial, first floor above, very wealthy people. Next floor, a little bit less wealthy people. Above that, middle class, working class people. And in the attic, very poor people, especially starving artists in our romantic imagination, but generally very poor people. So it's a vertical slice of society. But that's not the whole story. Haussmann's blocks had perimeters and they had interior courtyards. So the same colors are applied to very high cost apartments on the perimeter, very low cost apartments in the middle, so that you had a three-dimensional grid matrix of different income levels living in one block. Now it's all so expensive, it's a moot point, but the system worked very well for a while. And part of the genius of it is that the buildings on the perimeter have a great deal of perimeter wall, which was required to be very expensive carved stone. The ones on the middle have almost none. So they are, in fact, different in cost as well as in price. The American model is very different. We deal with separate buildings. This is a traditional American neighborhood, like many all across the country, in which you have a mix of apartment buildings, townhouses, small apartment buildings, big houses, and small houses. You can tell by the colors. So there's a mix of incomes in that block. And you can see there's a fine definition. The street to the right is a through street, so it has mostly apartments and smaller houses. The street to the left is less a through street and therefore has a lot of big houses on it. That didn't happen by legislation. It happened by the way in which people used the property and developed it. And all classes are tied together by an architectural consistency that unifies the neighborhood and masks the difference in income. That's the key quality, a local imagery of the best quality that masks differences. And then the mixed income developments can work very well. Another part of the same neighborhood, perhaps a more complex diversity in 1,200 feet from top to bottom, that's a variety of houses, a park, smaller houses and apartments, and then commercial uses. Now, compare that, which you see on the left, to what happened after World War II. With single-family zoning, you have no diversity, just one product. There's a lot of theory that a monoculture can't survive. Generally, single income, single type developments don't last through the first generation. They have to die and then come back again. So after the war, affluent people escaped to the suburbs to live in this, leaving the poor behind in desperate conditions. Public housing came in and built more uniformity, again, completely violating the American tradition. And of course, the motivation for single family housing was largely racial. When the Civil Rights Act started eliminating discrimination real estate developers and communities tried all sorts of ways to get around it, one of which is single family zoning, because they assumed Black people could not afford to live in a single family house, to buy a single family house. So the fractured nature of our physical environment is a result of a whole series of bad and sometimes badly intentioned legislations, and it's our job to try to fix that. An example that changes that is also in Norfolk, is a housing project which went, if you look at the plan, the two right-hand blocks were a project housing project that looked just like the one that I showed you before. Hope 6 project was done. We developed a plan. And you can see in pink, those are the rental units, which are subsidized, largely public housing level incomes. The white or the yellow houses in the second block are market rate houses. They even had a Homerama selling up to $400,000 and $500,000 immediately next to each other. How does it work? Well, the upper image is part of the subsidized housing. It's 2 units, not 1 unit. Below is the imagery of a sidewalk of the very expensive houses. And the key image is this one, where the two-level porch that you see on the far right is for 2 flats in the subsidized development. The two-level porch on the left is of a $500,000 house. And the vocabularies are the same vocabularies that you find in Norfolk neighborhoods. So the message is to do this, understand what the local vocabularies are, work within those traditional vocabularies, and produce an equivalent form for whatever the income group is. That's what Duchy of Cornwall has done in Poundbury and is doing now in Ansleden. It's the same basic idea. Here's just another example of the aerial photograph. The building types are similar, but some are home ownership, some are deeply subsidized, some are moderately subsidized, and some are in townhouses and some are in mid-rise buildings. They all share, again, the same vocabularies, which is the same as the slightly wonky photograph on the bottom right, which is from the adjacent neighborhood street looking to it. The community was adamant that this development should reflect the specific architectural vocabularies of Washington Hill, the neighborhood in Baltimore, to make that work. And apparently, it's had a positive impact on the property values in the areas around it. Just to be a little specific for a minute, these are different ways of combining different incomes. On the left is the traditional one I showed you. Below is Celebration, Florida, which was a breakthrough. But up to that point, developers would only do cottage style, which is low-cost housing here in one development, village style, which was medium priced, and estate style in another different, completely separated. What Disney was able to do because of their power in the marketplace was put them all in one block. But very specifically, they have each has their own address. So the smallest houses you see in the middle are facing each other on a street. The estates are facing out to the golf course, and so on. So that's a principle, an address with common values. On the upper right is public housing transformation in Louisville, Kentucky, in which these apartment buildings were designed actually by the architect William Rahn to look like a collection of traditional Louisville houses. In them, they have all 3 income levels: low income, moderate income, and straight market rate rental. Across the street, there are for sale standard spec houses. So in the plan, you can see on the right these houses, and on the left, in the different colors of yellow, the market rate houses. In Pittsburgh, a similar thing, mixed income in the apartments. You can see those on the north-south street, and then home ownership took place behind it, and so on. This is a way in which you can create a community that has mix of incomes but still works. Sometimes it's necessary to practice urban acupuncture. You have only a tiny piece, and this is one of those that helped turn around a whole section of the city because the new architecture reflected the existing traditional architecture that was there. I'm going to go on now to the last point, which is understanding the city and how to use it. Now, I've added to this is from Alvin Shore. How you understand the city has a lot to do with how you achieve your goals in life. So, one thing that this led me to do was study the psychology of perception. And I want to thank the editors of Anta and Stephen Sims in particular, because the new edition has a reproduction of my article from 1968, plus a new commentary of it on this. So I thought it was important to share just a little bit of it with you. Um, After looking at many towns, a psychologist who was also a cinematographer and I teamed up in our research work to study a series of small towns. And we set on to this town, which is called Zagarolo, east of Rome. And you can see it has a main street down the middle, which is in one, two, three, four distinct segments. Each segment ends in a piazza that connects you to the next segment. And each segment has a landmark at each end, which you can see what the landmarks are like down below. And we thought this was the most magical and clear structure we'd ever seen. But did it mean anything to people? Did the fact that we admired the structure mean anything to the people who lived there and used it? For whatever reason, my friend, my colleague, did not feel that this Corso was useful as a psychological test because there were too many associations with it. So we found a side street. There were two parallel streets, one short and one long. The short one was called the Vicolo Lungo, right? Or the long street. My psychologist friend got very excited because there's something called phenomenal time. How long an experience seems to take as opposed to how long it really takes, right? So psychologists use that to measure how well people understand a space. So the fact that the short street was the long street immediately caused him to think this might work. So we did interviews of 120 people. One group had was asked the question on this street, the long one, how long does it take to walk from point A to point B? The second group had the same distance marked as point A and B on the other street, the irregular unformed street. 99% of the participants confirmed, said that the short street was longer and the long street was shorter, which we took to mean that this visual structural richness really makes sense. I'll say one more thing about my colleague in this project. He was very interested in phenomenology, and the sketches that I did that you see above here were used in the interviews. He said, "When is a door not a door?" Anybody remember the grade school joke about that? When is the door not a door? Nobody remembers. Yes. Oh, when it's ajar. That's right. Absolutely right. Well, when is a door not a door? So he said, visualize walking down a street. The side walls are moving past you very quickly. You just see textures going past, fields of texture. And up ahead, there's a vertical line in that texture. And as you approach it, it gets wider and wider. And as you get close to it, it starts moving faster, starts opening up faster, and there's the door. And then you leave it behind, and it's no longer there. So if you think, I mention that because I think it's a very valuable way of thinking. When you're doing your design, think about what it's like to walk through it and where your eyes are focusing. And a fundamental principle of that is that objects on the side are a tiny fraction of the retinal image in your eye. Objects that are perpendicular to you are much larger as a retinal image in your eye. So if you're designing long linear streets, find ways to get perpendicular elements or changes in the angle to articulate that street. So the last point, finding your way around the city as a key to success. Our little friend here that we saw at the beginning has one big advantage. He's on a street. It's Manhattan. All the streets are connected to each other. Every door is connected to every other door. Wall Street is not far away. You could wind up there. Access to opportunity means you have opportunities available. It's the essence of the what I call the great democratic American grid. Every door is connected to every door. Every door is connected to opportunity if you want to take it. So we see this in large cities and small cities. The grid is there. You can easily get from house to shop to church to school, whatever it is. It's extended, and it is extended as the town's extended. It has its problems when you extend it too far, but the theory, and it doesn't need to be rectangular, can be irregular form so long as it's continuous. But here's the opposite of that. We did a project in England, east of London, in the most unfortunate new town called Basildon. You want to see a laboratory of what not to do, go to Basildon. And in Basildon is a place called Craylands, which was a social housing project of 700 units with no streets. You see there's one street around the perimeter. And you entered and you see the diagram, left-hand diagram is the one street and a network, labyrinthine network of parking spaces. Just so you know what it looked like, there's an image of one of those so-called green spaces in the middle and what the architecture was like. And there was some sort of pedestrian connection, but it was almost incomprehensible. Completely incomprehensible environment. A few stories. People living in this community have a 12-year shorter lifespan than people in adjacent neighborhoods. They use health facilities much less often than the rest of the city. It has a very high unemployment rate, and very few people seek jobs or training, even though there's a community college a block away. When we proposed streets, people were terrified about their children because their children, get this, did not know how to cross a street. The only streets they knew were highways. They didn't know how to do it. So think about someone growing up, trying to succeed in life, not knowing how to cross a street. We had a developer client once who had embroidered in a panel behind his desk so you couldn't miss it. Architecture can hurt you. This is an example of that. Architecture can hurt you. So we did a plan, and I'll show you just very quickly, that introduced a network of streets that's pretty labyrinthine, but it's because we had to preserve 75% of the existing buildings, which were not designed to be on streets. And we put in place a network of pedestrian streets that was more sensible and pedestrian connections, which are part of the street system, and developed an architecture that was more humane. Unfortunately, the first phase got under construction and the government changed and all the funding was withdrawn. And then immediately after that, the developer completely changed his team. So things went into hibernation for a while. It's now being redone. They're tearing down more houses and will hopefully have a more sensible plan. My final example is how we have destroyed the American grid. Remember, I view the American grid as sacrosanct. It's the essence of democracy and upward social mobility. Did I tell you? An historian once said, American city, late 19th, early 20th century, is the most efficient upward mobility machine the world has ever known. So this mobility machine was systematically being destroyed after the Second World War. So this is Norfolk, Virginia. On the left, you can see the grid pattern, very irregular, but continuous. And there were lots of east-west pedestrian scale connections, streets that you could also walk on easily, that are indicated in green. Now, the west half is affluent white. The left half is poor black. So after the war, this street system was put in place. where the grid was dissolved, there are no green lines because there are no pedestrian scale connections between east and west. And giant superblocks were put in that lose all of the effect of the fine grain grid. A lot of work was done on the west side, not on the east side, most of which we were responsible for, so that over time, a pedestrian scale interconnected network of streets and open space was developed. I was pointing to the wrong thing. On the left side, no, bottom left drawing. You can see it. Nothing on the east. In a recent master plan and in a major project to redevelop the public housing in what's called a choice neighborhood project, we were able to do in plan, at least, what you see on the upper right, which is to reconnect a number of those east-west streets. And if you look at the bottom right, you'll see the design of the redeveloped public housing project on the right is of a series of normal-sized city blocks with an interconnected grid of network. This is the work that needs to be done all over the country and has been through the Hope 6 program and others. Here's an aerial view. You can see the public housing project in the lower foreground, and you can see the barrier roads that separate it. There's flooding in the right-hand side of that image, and so a major part of it, of the infrastructure, is what's called a blue greenway, which is to manage the water in that whole flooding district with the park, which you see as this large form on the right-hand side. And then the neighborhood itself is an interconnected network of streets. The straight line street that you see connects the Martin Luther King Memorial with the Basilica of St. Mary's, which is a Catholic church from 1840, magnificent Gothic revival building and the center of the community. And then the old barrier road over on the left is now being tamed with actual crosswalks and things that can do it. So that framework then becomes the framework for a variety of different scales and sizes of houses, which is what's now being fought over, labored over, and worked on as part of the solution. So in conclusion, I'm going to go back to my favorite artist, Jean-Jacques Sempé. We see a couple sitting on their very small balcony in incredibly tiny chairs with their very tiny little pool, looking out and surveying their neighborhood. And she is very satisfied with it all. I mean, after all, it's a neighborhood whose image is very positive. It's Paris, after all. It's the best it could be. The exteriors of the buildings are all glorious. There's tremendous social capital. We saw earlier what happens when the tree trimmers come, and we saw people watching cats and all of that. So that ingredient is there. It's very diverse. I showed you the French apartment buildings and how you get a tremendous mix of incomes in it. And this is the clearest city in the world to find your way around. So they're very contented. But why is the man looking so intently? Well, if you look at the image on the left, what do you see in the distance? There's a construction crane. Something is happening. Something's going to disrupt or has the capacity to disrupt this fantastic environment. Will it be supportive and enhance these qualities, or will it diminish them and weaken them and start a process of diminishing the whole place? I think it's our job, particularly your job since I'm retired, but it's your job to see that that doesn't happen. Don't you think? Thank you.
Let's take some questions.
Anybody have a
Please
question?
speak to the mic. Uh,
Thank you for a really amazing lecture.
Thank you.
For the analysis of cities, especially when you were looking at the phenomena of time and how people experience space, did you explore that in any non-Western context, or
No,
was
I
it
did not.
no?
No, did not.
Do you think based off your experience, there might be a difference based off of Western urbanism versus Eastern or African types of urbanism?
I think that, well, I don't know because I haven't been to those places. The closest I've been to a different attitude about city building was in the Arab world in North Africa, and they are very different. The traditional environments are really very labyrinthine, and you need a code to sort of know where you are because of the introverted nature of the houses. A door might lead to a house, it might lead to a school, it might, in one case, it led to a slaughterhouse when I looked into the door. So that's a whole bunch of uses are buried in that. So I really can't answer that. And I've tried to focus only on things that I've actually experienced. And although I'm interested in the rest of the world, there's only so much one person can do, please. Well, I think I'd be delighted to find studies that do that. I mean, I think it's a great area of research and worth pursuing. I suspect, because human beings are human beings, that there are similar constructs and similar methods, but just as buildings are in different languages, cities are in different languages, and it will be different. Now, I do know of one example. There was a professor at Berkeley. I was asked to evaluate her thesis. I believe her name was it was Chow. I know several Chows. I'm trying to think which one it is. I think it was Renee Chow. And she had documented the traditional cities, which are now all being demolished by the regime, but the traditional cities in the traditional parts of several cities. And there was great similarity, actually. I mean, the forms were different, but the structures were actually very similar. So I'm sorry I can't answer your question, but I hope somebody, maybe you will, try to find out and figure it out. Be a great project. And trying to, I believe it's Renee Chow. You might look her up. She's teaching somewhere else now. She was at Berkeley. She's somewhere else. And see if you can get a hold of her thesis.
Thank you for the lecture. It was great. Can you speak to the way that these traditional cities were designed without a designer? Like how
Yes.
they naturally came about?
Yes, I feel strongly about that, actually. First of all, they happen slowly. So people could look at something and change it if they didn't like it or if it didn't work. So I believe they were designed pragmatically. I don't know that this is absolute, but they probably were not pre-planned. I mean, you have this great tradition from Greece through Rome, even into the Middle Ages, of planned towns where everything was laid out. Um, but I've always been fascinated with the vernacular towns that have very interesting street patterns and gorgeous spaces and beautiful buildings. They were built over time by people who were building for themselves. So naturally, all of these issues that I've been describing are satisfied because they were there. They knew it all. There are some interesting aspects, though. You can see it in the archaic plan of Athens, and you can see it in most vernacular villages and buildings. There is some sort street, maybe irregular, that connects gates and entrances into it. And they may be like this, but they go and do that. So there's a kind of built-in hierarchy right there. If not originally, over time, because something that's more traveled may encourage different kinds of uses than you would have on a street that's not traveled very much. So you tend to have public uses on streets that have more traffic and private uses on streets that are more private. So that's one thing. Also, they evolved over time, and I've observed that in many of these towns, as they became part of a larger society, when they're an isolated society, it's one thing, but then they became part of a larger society, trade started happening. So people who weren't from there were coming there and they needed to welcome them because they were doing business with them. things started to change. So in many of them, there is a street, sometimes only one, sometimes several, that curves and bends around for purely pragmatic reasons. We don't know what they were, but someone wanted to expand a building or change this, or somebody owned a property and wouldn't let the street go through. Any one of those practical reasons. But in any case, there is a structure to it. Now, coming back to my point about when you're walking along with parallel walls, things flash past very quickly and you don't see them. But if there's something perpendicular, you see it. It's at those points on those curved streets that you will always see a tower, a fancy doorway, or something that's different from the surrounding to give coherence to the town. So that wasn't an architect coming down and saying, do this. It was the people themselves. It might have been someone who'd been successful in business. In the Middle Ages, there were incredible trading going on all over Europe, and wanted to build his house and make it be prominent, so he might have cleared away somebody else's house, bought it, and then built his and had it stick out with a big tower so that you could see it. Or it might have been a church, tearing down some buildings and building a larger church. Whatever that building operation was, usually, not always, but usually on those streets that have some kind of inflection. There's a lot to be learned in that. This is gonna be more than you asked for, but there's a lot to be learned from that, I think, in our present state. My career has been working with large-scale efforts in small places, trying to tone them down and make them seem like they were natural or incremental. There's a growing movement around the United States, particularly with gridlock in Washington and accelerated now with the sense of hopelessness that anything is going to be able to happen to help cities, of sort of grassroots development in which a couple people will get together and do something. Or they might put an ADU in the backyard, or they might buy a house that's derelict and fix it up and do it. Or they might buy an empty lot and build a new building. There is actually a lot of that right here in South Bend. I don't know whether you're aware of it, but the near Northwest community has been written about nationally, actually. The near Northwest community, a man named Mike Keene, and it's the Near Northwest Community Development Corporation was, not sure it's a corporation, but Near Northwest something was the spark, was one of the sparks that individual people were. So now there's something like 50 different people doing little projects all around, and it works because it's in the context of an existing city. Most of what they're doing is restoring tumble-down houses. There's some new construction, much of which is very sensitive to the environment and uses the same vocabularies. Not all, but much of it is. And I see this as a new move, as a new wave, as a, we got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, I'll go to the bigger and bigger part for a minute. When we work on these kinds of projects, it's now almost impossible to get in the big projects, single family houses or duplexes or even row houses, just because the construction and financing industry is all about the 501 apartment buildings, or and sometimes single family houses, but usually not. So it's getting harder and harder to do it. And the contractors say, we can't afford to build a single family house. We can build this apartment building. Can't afford to do townhouses. It's too expensive. I'm involved in two situations now in Norfolk. One is a big project where it costs $256,000 construction costs for a two-bedroom apartment in a building in a little neighborhood, very distressed neighborhood that has a strong civic leadership. The firm I've worked with has developed a plan book with pre-approved plans for very traditional houses of 16 to 1,700 square feet that are being built for 160,000. So that difference of $100,000 is the difference between a big scale operation, which layers upon layers of expense, much of which has nothing to do with building the end result. It's financing, marketing, all of that kinds of stuff. So I see that there is a potential movement for doing small things. Now, the challenge in that is design consistency and appropriate decisions if they're not already there. And so we, for example, I didn't talk about it all, we initiated the revival of pattern books. Stefanos mentioned this. And we did one for an interesting joint venture, a joint venture between the Institute for Classical Art and Architecture and Habitat for Humanity. And it's called Building Neighborly Houses. I think the pattern book and plan books have a great role. They are what made the great 19th century and 20th century, early 20th century neighborhoods of America. They're all done with pattern books and plan books, done by individual builders. Same thing with George in London. There was a pattern book, and all those squares with identical Georgian houses were built. It sent the historian, Sir John Somerset, into despair, by the way. He said, "Oh my God, even a bricklayer could design a house." Well, I say, hooray, this is what we want. Because urbanism has to be at scale. You need lots of buildings to create urban spaces. And if they don't work together, it's not going to work. So, long answer to a short question, but thank you. Everybody's afraid to raise their hand or we'll be here another half hour.
Okay. I think we have lots of drawings to do in the next few weeks. Thank you, Ray. Thank you
Great.
very much.
Thank you. Thank
Come
you.
back, please.
Okay.